It's Jeremy. Good morning, everybody. We decided we would break this presentation. No, can you guys hear us in the back? Okay. We're going to break today's presentation kind of in three sections. First, Greg's going to talk about bats. Then we're going to talk about habitat management and prescribed fire. And then at the very end, we'll talk about the HCP. We'll try to jam that in because we've got a lot to cover. So, Greg, I'll let you take the first stretch.
All right, thanks. Definitely going to try and keep this at a point of how this is more valuable to you guys in particular, thinking about bats and habitat and how we can benefit the bats in my primary point of view, but also secondarily, what are some of the risks and threats out there. So we do have 9 species of bats. So we have 9 species of bats that we consider residents in PA, and we can break these kind of into 2 groups, 2 guilds, if you will. The first group is what we call migratory bats, and there's 3 of them that we consider residents. We do have some accidentals that come in, like Seminoles or evening bats, but these 3 bats, the way we can kind of think about them is the females are going to be flying to the north in the summer and coming back down south in the winter. So the males kind of hang out centrally located. So we have males on these 3 species here year round. Sometimes the males will roost in the leaf litter in the winter when they're kind of in the cold periods and torpor. And then on the warm days, they actually get up and feed. So they can be active pretty much year round. And their main job is just to wait for the females to fly through and mate with them as they're on their migration routes. Always technical difficulties. There we go. All right, so these are our tree or migratory bats. And so on the top, we have the red bat, which is pretty obvious to decipher. We have the silver-haired bat, and then we have the hoary bat being our largest bat with about a 16-inch wingspan. So these guys can cruise around about 35, 40 miles an hour flying. They're a lot less maneuverable, so they're going to be flying above the canopy. They're larger bats, and so they're going to be eating larger type prey, a lot of beetles, if you will. Then we have what we call our hibernating bats or our cave bats. These are the guys that are most endangered, obviously, and that reason would be white nose syndrome. But these are long-lived animals. They can live up to 35 years in the wild, and they're really small. Some of them are about 5 grams. And their general life cycle is to hibernate for half of their life. So they spend 6 months every year in this kind of latitude hibernating, and then they come up above ground in the summer, and then they have to feed like crazy. So they're eating somewhere between 900,000 to 1 million insects per year per bat. And they're living 30 plus years. So that's a lot of insect control that's going on out there. And primarily they're foraging in our forests. So they're keeping our forests healthy. The threat to these guys, though, when they're hibernating is white nose syndrome. This is what has caused a lot of this color here. So the red's kind of indicating the federal listing, they're federally endangered. Yellow is state endangered or state listed. And then we have the big brown bat, which is the one that seems to be doing fairly well with white nose syndrome and has no listing. And so, as I said, winter is the primary threat for white nose syndrome in these bats. And basically what it does is it causes them to come out of hibernation 2 to 3 times more frequently than they should. And that burns up energy. And so if you're planning to hibernate for 6 months, you obviously have to store up a lot of energy. And so when you think about their life cycle, and we're starting here with winter, right? So let's say they make it through winter, they come out, they have almost no fat reserves left. So they're going into hibernation with about 1 gram of brown fat. And that has to last them 6 months. And the bulk of that is that energy is used when they come out of hibernation periodically. White nose syndrome is causing them to come out more often than they should, depleting their energy reserves halfway through the hibernation period, and they fly out starving to death and die, whether they freeze or get predated. But let's say they make it out and they survive. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. So one of the things we want to do is prevent disturbances, which can also cause energy depletions. So where we have a lot of really key sites, we gate them, and that whole purpose is to keep humans out of those sites. But there are other ways that bats can be disturbed besides humans. If there's a lot of vibrations and the ground shaking, and some of these bats can be near the entrances, just simply talking near these sites, and obviously smoke as well. So a lot of ways that they can be disturbed. And currently with the regulations, there's about a 1/4 mile buffer usually put around most of these openings. But I put up here just a small map to think about the footprint of a mine or a cave is not necessarily just where the opening is. So this is an example of a mine on Game Lands 51 down in Fayette County. This mine goes back into the hill about 1.5 miles. So no little 1/4 mile buffer around the opening is going to protect way in the back. And there can be multiple openings. For those of you from the coal regions, we can have mines that have 90 to 100 openings. There can be multiple tiers and levels, all interconnected. A lot of those could be near the surface. So if you're doing burns, that smoke can, get sucked into those sites, and that's going to cause a disturbance, cause those bats to arouse. Those are the types of things that we're trying to protect from. And just to give you an idea, we always joke that Pennsylvania's hollow. Between all of the drillings that we do and all of the mining, we've got iron mines, limestone mines, coal mines, uranium mines, you name it, iron. There's holes everywhere out there, thousands. I think we have about 5,000 abandoned mines in the state. The largest mine I've been in, just to give you an idea, is 50 million square feet of passage out in the western part. It's enormous. Driving in my vehicle, it takes me 20 minutes to get from the opening to the section that actually has bats. Pretty much anywhere you're at, holes in the ground could be out there and there could be bats. So if they survive white nose syndrome and they come out, they have a lot of energy demands. They have white nose syndrome. They have to heal from that. They have mating that occurs in the fall, migrations that occur in the spring and the fall, and they can migrate upwards of 400, 500 miles, some of these bats. And so again, the theme being energy, they takes a lot of energy. So they're coming out of hibernation with almost no energy left. So they need to be foraging as they fly along. And then they can roost pretty much anywhere. In the summertime, the females are going to aggregate and form colonies of young, and they kind of work together to help raise those youngs. So they can be in houses, they can be in urban areas, obviously in trees, and they like places that are permanent. And the colonies that we see getting larger and larger are usually more permanent type structures, or in some cases trees, I guess, with like the shagbark hickories. Those trees can stick around for hundreds of years versus, an exfoliating piece of bark on a dead tree. That's going to blow off pretty quickly. And so those type of colonies tend to be a little bit smaller, a little bit more fission fusion kind of thing going on with those. But again, a lot of different bats, a lot of different strategies for how they go about things. And so variety in what they eat is out there. So I always kind of equate the little brown, which forages over a lot of water, with like the fly fishing guy. So if you're out there and you're fly fishing, and one day you're out there and you figure out, oh, they're eating caddis flies, and you catch a bunch of fish, and then you come back out the next week and it's a whole new insect, right? And so you figure it out and you work and work and work, and you figure out, okay, now it's a stonefly, and then you start catching fish, drifting that through. Well, the bats are doing the same thing the trout are. They're eating what's most abundant, what's best tasting, what has the most energy. And so the more insects we have, the higher the quality habitat we have, the better it's going to be for the bats. And these bats are going to find where the food is at. That's what they do. And so there was a project just recently done on some areas in Pennsylvania and others where Bat Conservation International went out and they found ways to bring more insects into key areas using lights, but they brought more insects in and immediately the bats responded and started foraging in those areas. And I'm going to kind of tail this off with the next version of this is we're going to be working with Bat Conservation International on a project that's basically looking at improving habitat and improving the diet of bats, trying to help get them more energy to help them survive white nose syndrome. So we're just beginning this, and the first phase of this will be obviously picking where we're going to be going, but then we're going to be studying the bats and looking at what they're actually eating and looking at what is available out there to eat. And then we want to come in and do some habitat management and try and increase that insect diversity and the abundance, and then see what the response is with the bats. And so it's quite possible that, you know, some of the areas that we may be working in over the next couple of years on a study like this may involve some of you out there looking to do some habitat improvements through a variety of different ways. And if you, Scott, want to kind of take over a little?
Okay, thanks, Greg. So when Greg and I were trying to figure out how to talk about habitat management, Greg has already touched on just not only the diversity of species, but the diversity of life strategies. You have the tree bats that are like B-52 bombers, the way that they fly, but you have the Myotis mouse-eared bats flying around like F-16 fighter jets. They're completely different habitats. And then you layer on their life strategies of hibernation, and bats are actually incredibly social. So you have these fall swarming activities that you need to kind of create habitats for. And then you have the summer pup rearing habitats. So all of that complexity, it's hard to really encapsulate into habitat management strategy. So what we decided to do was just reference everybody to Greg's Pennsylvania Bat book. There's a chapter in there. It's actually one of the last chapters because when we were putting that book together, we thought we need one chapter that tackles habitat management. So for everybody in the Game Commission, sorry for everybody else, but this is on the H drive. If you go to the H drive in the habitat management folder in the State Lands HCP, this bat habitat management chapter is in there. For everybody else, if you need this chapter, just let us know. But essentially, we break down habitat management into three kind of categories. You have those hibernaculum areas, similar to what Greg mentioned, the area immediately around the entrance and then surrounding the entrance. Similarly, you have riparian and stream corridors and wetlands, so immediately around the streams and then generally more broad buffers around the streams and how to manage those various habitats. And then we get into in that chapter a little bit more about, you know, forest, non-forest, the matrix of everything else, essentially. So we're just going to kind of leave it there. We'll dive into a few things just to kind of summarize what we're thinking about when we're talking about bat habitat management. And let me see if I'm not going to be able to move that. Oh, maybe I can. Hold on. Okay, so two things when you're thinking about habitat management. Greg had talked about how important, like you're a fly fisherman and you're adapting, how important that insect community is to our Pennsylvania bats. All Pennsylvania bats are insect eaters. We don't have any fruit bats here yet, but so insect diversity is what's really important. So insect habitat and varied clutter. That's what you need to be thinking about, insects and varied clutter. So essentially, writ large, generally speaking, good habitat management is good bat management. They're generally similar. Good insect habitats are good bat habitats. That's the other thing, going back to that insect and varied clutter. And then if you have that varied clutter, what we're talking about is essentially diversity of habitats. So the way we think about that and the way we kind of summarize it is talking about these four diversity metrics. We're talking about managing for species diversity. Of course, as Greg had mentioned, those, and these are all listed in that book chapter, but tree species that really promote that flaky bark, that's perfect. Shoot for those species. Species diversity, manage for species diversity. Also be managing for age class diversity. Or what, well, we'll move on. But age class diversity, you want a bunch of old growth, you want a bunch of early successional forests. That's what we're looking at. Similar, that's in the forest, but also in the fields, also in the old shrubs. You want older senescent grasslands, but you also want young, vibrant grasslands. That dichotomy of age classes of your habitats is really important. Structural diversity, what we're talking about here is we're talking about snags, we're talking about a good shrub layer, a good mid-story. We're talking about coarse woody debris on the forest floor. Things like that. That'll give you your structural diversity. That'll be really important for bat habitat. And the last thing is landscape level diversity. Really what we're talking about here, another way of describing that is interspersion, this interspersion of different habitats across your landscape. So make it messy, make it full of clutter, intersperse different things across your forest, across your game land, across your fields. That's what we're talking about. Those 4 diversity metrics are what you want to be thinking about when you're talking about bat habitat. Anything else there?
No, I think that's spot on.
Okay. Okay, so you know how we're doing on time. We doing okay, Jeremy? Now, let's transition to the HCP. So for non-agency people, I do want to apologize. This is a little bit agency centric, but even for the non-agency people, understanding the state lands HCP, I think is really important. Why do we need an HCP? So here's the deal. Any kind of habitat management work that we do that involves any federal dollar, you have to run a PNDI, right? We have to do to see whether we're going to get a hit with an endangered species. For us agency folks, we're doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these habitat management projects. So that would mean hundreds and hundreds of PNDI runs. With the bat species that are currently listed, you know, we have Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats. Those 2 bat species, we would be getting hit pretty much with every habitat project that we do. So that would mean that every project we'd have to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It would bog down everybody. So the state agencies, and so this is a partnership between the Game Commission and DCNR, and of course that means Bureau of Forestry and Bureau of State Parks. The 3 of our organizations got together and put together this HCP. Now, what that HCP essentially means is it's our statement that says we're gonna follow all these different things. We're gonna do all these things to protect bats. And by making that commitment and giving it to the feds, U.S. Fish and Wildlife says, okay, well, here's an incidental take permit. You are now allowed to officially take bats. In other words, a federalese for killing bats. And the way they measure that is through some fancy math that is essentially our taking of habitat. Okay, so by following the HCP, we're allowed to have this incidental take permit. So again, I guess ironically, it advanced at the right time. So I should be talking about, I should have this slide up. So we're talking about 3 agencies, DCNR, State Forest, State Parks, and Game Commission, working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I gotta say, in all the partnerships I've been a part of, this HCP has just gone incredibly well. Our partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been phenomenal. There's so much mutual respect. There's so much appreciation for all of the gray, all of the fuzz. This is so complicated. You know, when I get questions, and I get questions about this a lot, I have to take a pause and think about it. And I have to go back to the HCP and look and try to interpret sentences. Where's Hagenstaller? You're familiar with this. We struggled with something just last week. But right now, currently, the HCP covers the Indiana bat and the northern long-eared. But keep in mind that tricolors and even little browns, it pains both Greg and I to hear that, and many of you, I'm sure, that little browns are coming down the pike for being considered endangered, but they are. So we are currently now in the process that this group, DCNR and the Game Commission, working on adding these 2 additional bat species because we know the federal listing is coming down the pike. We're We're trying to get ahead of it so that we don't get bogged down in this federal situation with having to do PNDI reviews for everything. So we are adding tricolors and little browns to our HCP. We're probably 2 years out, depending on federal grant situation. Holy smokes. Depending on federal grant situations, but right now we're thinking we're about 2 years out from adding those species to our HCP. So the HCP covers a couple of different things. It covers forest management. It covers timber harvesting, prescribed fire. Not so much for the Game Commission, but for DCNR folks, it also covers firewood collection, roads and trail development, and fencing, deer fencing. So each one of those activities has a bunch of things, again, in this HCP that we've committed to. Said we're going to do these things, right? So let's talk a little bit about those things and what are those restrictions. There's essentially restrictions on the where and the when. Okay, so again, this gets complicated quickly, but what we're talking about is those restrictions for those different habitats. So in the summer habitat, there's no restrictions for management in grasslands and barrens and scrub oak, things like that. You're okay. It's only when you come to a forest, that's when you get into the rub. Okay, so in forests, especially with prescribed fire, now keep in mind, I'm only talking about the prescribed fire restrictions here, but burning is restricted from May 15th to August 15th. That covers the Indiana bat. If you're overlaying your habitat management work on top of an Indiana bat polygon, summer polygon. Northern long-eared, it's a little bit different. If you take the summer habitat polygon for northern long-eareds and you're going to do a prescribed fire, you're restricted between June 1st and July 31st. So just June and July, right? And I won't read all of this. It's all in the HCP, but I just do want to summarize. That's what you're getting hit for summer. In the fall, spring, it's a little bit easier, but essentially 5 miles around hibernaculum. And then in the winter, 1/4 of a mile around hibernaculum in the forest only, okay? So those are the restrictions for prescribed fire. Now, again, this slide is a little bit of a repeat, but it just lays it out. And again, that when you see conservation or CM dash whatever, these are the conservation measures that, again, we have said we are going to follow these things to abide by the HCP so that we can have our incidental take permit. So for prescribed fire, there's a bunch of things that you need to do to keep us compliant with the HCP. You have to have a burn plan. I think these are generally pretty low-hanging fruits. I think we're all doing these, but just so you're aware, this is what is called out in the HCP. Every prescribed fire has to have a burn plan. That burn plan must include a smoke management plan. That's important. It's got to be in there to abide by the HCP. And that smoke plan must list and describe any smoke-sensitive areas. So make sure you're calling that out. Burns have to be in the appropriate season and has to be in the right weather. And then this is an important one. As a burn boss, you want to be paying attention to minimizing the loss of potential roost trees. That is actually noted in the HCPs. Pay attention to that. Now, when you're doing ignitions, when you're on that prescribed fire, pay attention to these things as well. You want to be actually cueing the tree roosting bats. Steve Bernardi and I were talking just yesterday about how many times he sees bats flying out of the unit. As soon as you get smoke across that unit, those bats should be waking up, arousing, and flying away. That's what we want. It's actually called out in the HCP is to try to get smoke into the unit so that the bats can fly away. Proceed slowly at first. Again, these are coming right out of the HCP. Proceed slowly at first, and then you can increase your speed afterwards. Now, I do want you to see and pay attention to what we have down here at the bottom. You are trying to reduce fire intensity, especially around those trees with the flaky bark, so that your plume, your flame length is less than 6 feet, so that you're avoiding crown scorch, and you want your plume to be less than 140 degrees at roost height. Now, roost height, I don't know if Greg has any opinions about what roost height is, but I would say you're talking about 15, 20 feet and around that point, but it's actually not defined as far as roost height. But try not to send a whole hot plume right into your flaky barked trees. Also, if you do observe bats, you do want to notify fire leadership and have a discussion and let Greg and I know especially if you find dead bats. That's another big issue, and we want to know about that. You don't have to cease operations, but we need to know about it because we need to report it, because every year, again, I didn't mention this, I should have, the HCP is a 30-year agreement. Right now, we're in year 5. So we have another 25 years of this HCP. So every year, we're filing an annual report with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So if you're killing bats or you see dead bats, things like that, you don't have to cease your operations, but please document it. Take photographs and let us know about it, and we will put that in our annual report. It will be considered part of our take, and that's okay. And I'll say why that's okay in a little bit here. Another important part is follow your streamside buffer, your streamside management plans that you have set aside for your agency. Implement spill prevention measures, another thing. Erosion and sedimentation plans, have all that stuff. Greg, do you want to talk about this one at all?
Yeah.
Here, come on. There's a bunch of other things that are in the HCP. How are we doing? We're okay? Bunch of other things, not only related to prescribed fire, but there's things that we're going to do proactively to help bats. And that's what Greg is responsible for as part of the HCP. So we wanted to touch on that because there's actually a lot of really cool things happening for habitat conservation.
So I will just iterate that the talk about the HCP, the driving home point of this is it allows us to manage our forests and do so with the least amount of stress and time delays as possible. So these conservation measures that we're talking about are really being done to help you guys do what you need to do. So as far as some of the conservation measures, we have to, for example, put up bat boxes. So it was deemed that where Indiana bats and long-eared bats were, and keep in mind, long-eared bats, little brown bats, tricolored, Scott kind of alluded to this, those bats were really numerous before white nose syndrome. They were everywhere. So basically the entire state would light up as far as where they are at, which is why we're at the point of doing these HCPs. But installing bat boxes. So bat boxes are locations where the females can gather and raise young. So we have to put those in those key locations. I think collectively we had at least 90 bat boxes that had to be installed over the 30-year term. We've already accomplished that task. We also have to gate sites. So we know that where bats, especially where these endangered bats are at, those are very important key sites. And so we want to gate them and keep people from going in and disturbing them. Typically, it's kids, your local kids that are trying to go in and explore these sites. There is some recreational type of use at some sites, but in general, working with those organized groups, we can try and get a seasonal use policy at those sites. But in order to do these gates, we have to build at least 30 gates. I'll say it might be closer to 40, but whatever the total number is for Indiana and long-eared bats, DCNR and Game Commission are required to build that many. So we've actually been hosting gate building workshops, which I know a few of you in the audience have attended. And the Game Commission has gone and bought a trailer and stocked that up with all of the equipment that we need to. And we are on a course of building at least one back gate per year to stay in compliance with this. As we get to the amended part, hopefully that gate measure doesn't increase, because where we're gating those most important sites that contain the long-eared and Indiana bats typically contain tricolors and long-eareds or little browns as well. So some of the other conservation measures there, the landscape level forest management, enhancing the roosting and foraging. So as we go along, and Scott touched on this, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but just, trying to preserve those large trees like shagbark hickories or large oaks that have the flaky bark for the bats. Actually, as you go in and manage, so these bats, as I alluded really briefly on, they all have different habitats and preferences, ways they forage. Some are hawkers, grabbing insects out of the air with their mouths. Some of them are gleaners. And Scott said they're like the jet pilots, right? So like the northern long-eared bats, they can fly at full speed through the thickest scrub oak barrens you can think of and detect the tiniest little caterpillars or spiders on leaves and glean them right off of there. And so having that variety of habitat is really important as we think about structural forest structure moving forward.
Okay, so you can stay up there if you want. Where are we with the HCP? Like how are we looking? Are we kind of like hitting the top? Because keep in mind, with the HCP, we are given a certain amount of take through that incidental take permit. In other words, there's a cap. We're only good until we reach X number of acres for each one of these kind of habitat management types. So how are we doing? So the whole pizza pie for, you have Indiana bats on the left and northern long-eared on the right. The whole pizza pie is how much take or habitat we're allowed to impact through all activities. So in other words, I can't do the math in my head really quick like this, but for Indiana bats, you have in blue, the acres that we have impacted. This is from our report that we just turned in mid-January. So for the 2024 year, this is how much acres we have impacted. So we've eaten 24% of the pizza pie, but we still have 76% of the pizza pie left. So we're doing great, essentially is what that means. We're only impacting about a quarter of the habitats that we could potentially impact. This is every year that overlays with the Indiana bat habitats. Same kind of story for northern long-eared bat habitats. Keep in mind, when I say that, we're just talking about the polygons of what those habitats are. We're at about 28% of that pizza pie that we've eaten. So we still have plenty of habitat that we could potentially impact through our habitat management work. So we're in really good shape. Now, of course, like I said, we're also going to be adding these 2 bat species to the HCP. So these pizza pies are going to look a lot different in a couple years, and the HCP is going to be double the complexity because now we're adding 2 more species. But don't worry, you guys, we'll try to make this as easy for everybody as we possibly can. So, here I break it down for prescribed fire and timber harvest. That last pizza pie was everything. Here's it broken down a little bit more. So timber harvest, this is where for Indiana bats, they're on the left. This is where we have really probably eaten most of our pizza. And that's about half of the pizza eaten there for timber harvesting. You can see the actual take in blue and the permitted take remaining in orange for timber harvest, and then of course for prescribed fire. For prescribed fire, we thought we would be, burning a lot more. We haven't been able to get there, so we still have plenty of take remaining for Indiana bats and for northern longears. Okay, hopefully that gives you a good sense of where we're at with the HCP. So there's a couple things I forgot to mention though. If you want to know about the HCP, if your agency, I think, Miles, I saw you take a picture of it. Again, for the Game Commission, it's on the H drive, Bureau of Wildlife Management. There's a State Lands HCP folder, and that has everything related to the HCP. For Bureau of Forestry folks, Rebecca reminded me that it's in your intra-forestry page on the BAT HCP page. Am I getting that right, Jeremy? Sounds right? Okay, so intra-forestry, there's a BAT HCP folder of some sort for y'all to go in and learn more about the HCP. State Parks, Nick Decker, where are you at? Nick, he's not here today. Anybody from State Parks want to talk about where their HCP stuff is at? Okay, it's there somewhere. Don't worry about it. Talk to us later. They're able to access it. Oh, okay, perfect. Well, there you go. Perfect. Now, for everybody else that's not agency, again, I apologized in the beginning, but I do want to let you know that we are getting hit a lot, or I shouldn't say hit, that's not the right verb. We are getting asked a lot about Pennsylvania state land HCP. This has proven, this HCP is groundbreaking. States from all over the country are saying, how did Pennsylvania do that? And how can we do it too? And it's not just state agencies, it is timber investment management organizations. It's anybody that's doing habitat management work that it has federal funding associated with it. They want to, Rebecca Bowen and I get asked frequently, hey, can we just piggyback onto your HCP? And we have to say, no, I'm sorry, this is for state lands only. But there's a lot of interest in our HCP and a lot of folks want to replicate it. So for those that are non-agency, we're happy to talk about it. And if you are interested in HCP, let us know. Now, again, to kind of summarize this HCP stuff, everybody recognizes that this is complex. We've talked about all the species of bats, we've talked about the habitats, and then you add in all the Fed speak on top of it all. It makes your head spin. So if you have questions or if you're trying to interpret a sentence in the HCP and it just doesn't make sense, call me or Rebecca or Greg, and we will work with you to try to figure out whether we're in compliance. And if there is an issue where it's like, man, I got to get this burn done, and it's inside that window where you're telling me I can't burn, let's have a conversation about it. It does not mean that absolutely no. It means that's okay. Let's talk to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and see if we can work with them to get approval to proceed with that prescribed fire inside that window. So don't feel like we can't have a conversation about this stuff, because like I said from the beginning, this has been a great partnership with Game Commission, DCNR, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is giving us that incidental take permit. They've been great. So we can have a conversation with them to say, look, here's this one fire, it's for 5 years and we haven't had to have that conversation yet. If we need to have that conversation with Fish and Wildlife, I'm sure they would be more than happy to have that conversation. If they say no, well, at least we tried and we know for next time, but let's at least have a conversation. So anyway, with that, I think we have time for questions. And well, do you have anything else?
No, I'm good.
Greg's good. Okay, questions. Uh-oh. Brian's asking a question.
Think about a question on CPBMs and HCP. Do they have to worry about state or?
All right, next question. CPBMs, if there is federal funding involved in any way, they would need to run a PNDI for their burn unit. For them, I think what they could do is they could essentially, because there aren't hundreds of projects that they would be doing, they'd have half a dozen. They would probably just run it through their standard PNDI review process. And they would, or when they get a hit, they would work independently with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to address that hit, that potential take. So that would they would not have to worry about the HCP. They would just do it as a normal PNDI review.
Only if there's federal funding involved in their burn.
That's right. Yep, because the reason we have PNDI is to account for Section 6 review. So the feds require, if they're giving you money, they require you to make sure you're not impacting endangered species. Good question. There's a question in the back that Dan's pointing to. Rodney, is that you?
Yeah. Quick question about backboxes. On game land, you put a lot of backboxes up. It sounds like the program requires you to document some of that stuff. Is that information that we can get you to help? And we have a lot of game lands in wetland areas where they spray for a lot of bugs, especially the mosquitoes. Outside the agency, like 301 up there in Eldred, and which is the main bird system. But at any rate, there's a lot of shagbark hickory, there's spraying there. Could you address backbox issue? Should we be really focusing on trying to put that on the lands and reporting that to the
The short answer is yes. We have what's called the Appalachian Bat Count Program, where we track and monitor every bat box that we install. And for the HCP, there are bat boxes that we had to install in very specific locations. And those were all recorded, and we have to also do annual counts or biannual counts until those boxes become occupied. which may or may not occur in our lifetimes. But yeah, so there's a lot of boxes out there that where they go in, they should be recorded, and that data should be sent to us. If there are areas that you want to have bat boxes put up, we are caught up finally and have a little bit of a reserve set of bat boxes. I think I have at least a good 30 or 40 of the aluminum shell bat boxes on hand now. So if there are areas that need a bat box, a good wetland, a good area with a lot of shagbarks, we can certainly do that. We cannot control DEP and what they do for spraying for mosquitoes, to my knowledge. I think that's kind of, they go through their process with the feds. I'm sure there's federal funds involved in getting that money. And so that's just kind of, it's like our process with the HCP, but something that they do on their own. And I think for the most part, that only deals with mosquitoes. It's not killing non-target insect species out there. So
this goes for everybody in the state agencies. Please, if you're doing these kinds of projects, please take pictures of them. We really needed more pictures in our annual report this year to kind of photo document what all we were doing. So please take pictures and send them to Greg and me. Rodney, send them to Scott. Yeah. Send them to Greg. We can talk, that project in Eldred, that's a bailiwick, that's a political conversation, but yeah, let them keep spraying. Travis?
So Greg, you had a piece on one of the slides regarding bat population. Can you touch on that for us? Where bat populations are heading?
Like the trend of bat populations.
Right.
Big brown bats are doing really well. And they do get infected from white nose, but they get very, very little of it. And so it doesn't seem to impact their survival in any way. Small-footed bats are doing fairly well. We have documented them with white nose, and there has been some dead small-footed bats found, but for general purposes, they're doing fairly well. They're a rare bat to begin with. They focus mainly on talus slopes, high walls, cliff faces. They get into the cracks in those. So we're dealing with other issues with mine reclamation, and DEP has lots of money for mine reclamation going on right now. Whole different ball game there than what we're dealing with here, but that species is doing fairly well. The other 4 species are the ones that are most highly impacted. So Indiana bats have been federally endangered since the Endangered Species Act came about. Pennsylvania had about 1,000 hibernating Indiana bats. We now have about 6 left that we know of. That doesn't mean there isn't a hole in the ground that I haven't encountered full of Indiana bats, but the chances are not high. In summertime, now these bats, if you think of a hibernation site with 500 bats, you're going to get bats going in every direction and at every distance. Some bats will go 1 mile, some bats will go 500 miles. We don't know why. It's the same thing in reverse as well. If you have a maternity colony, they're going to go to all different hibernation sites. So when we think of bats, we have the summer and the winter period. So with Indiana bats, 1,000 individuals down to 6 individuals sounds very, very bleak. In the summertime, we have a maternity colony that has 150 to 200 bats. It changes annually based on the day we count it. But as a ballpark, half of those bats are Indiana bats. We have banded those bats and found those bats going to a couple different locations in Pennsylvania, up to New York, New Jersey, and then 420 miles away to Carter Caves in Kentucky. And those actually happen to be the longest documented bat migrations by Indiana bats there. So when I talk about Indiana bats, and it sounds really bleak, there's about 650,000 Indiana bats known still alive. Pennsylvania is not a big Indiana bat state, and their population seems to be fairly stable. There's a particular site in Missouri that has 500,000 Indiana bats. And then there's a few other key sites. And then there's like nothing. So I think what happened when they're a very social bat, what Scott talked about, and when white nose came and took the vast majority, we lost 99% of our cave bats. And they're social, and so they probably want to aggregate and go where the survivors are at. So I think that's what happened, is a lot of them withdrew in the wintertime back to those core sites in the Midwest. And then in the summer, they go wherever. So little browns, we lost 99.9% of them. There was probably, and this is a total ballpark guess, but probably close to 30 million little brown bats in Pennsylvania in every location you can think of. It's probably not a square mile that didn't have them. Even in like downtown Philly, probably had some. We lost the vast majority of those. We now know of about 15,000 of them left in the States. We've been doing migration work and finding them and finding new colonies and trying to protect those. They seem to be stable and slightly increasing, which is the good news there. Tricolors, we have not much of a clue. We have, our largest site has 83 tricolored bats. Our next largest has 25, and then we know of a bunch that have single digits. They seem to be stable and slightly increasing based off of winter counts, but really low numbers, just like the others. And then the same would be with long-ears, is they seem to be found in most of the habitats that had them before white nose in Pennsylvania, but Virginia, New York, variety of other states, they can't even find them anymore, it seems. So they're not doing that great, except for Pennsylvania. So what's that? Oh, fat bats. Yeah, so I didn't want to get into white nose too much, but as far as some of the things bats are doing to help get through white nose, one of the things we document is they're packing on more fat in the fall to survive white nose, which is drawing on that energy. So they have a phase called macro, I'm drawing a blank on the scientific name, but anyway, they gorge themselves in the fall. And that's an area where we can do some of this diverse habitat management to try and increase insects and have the ability for them to get as much fat in the fall right where they're at near those hibernation sites.
Yeah. So think about that when you're planning your habitat management. You could be helping these bats really gorge themselves on insects getting ready to go into hibernation. That could help them.
Good fatty ones.
Good fat bats.